The goal of this series is to turn 200 million 07 into max cash. We will do this by playing poker only. The button raises 4 times the blinds, which seems pretty strong to me, but as much as I hate playing offsuit aces, I knew this was too strong to fold. And I thought he didn't really connect with his flop very often because he raised a pretty big pre-flop, so I thought he had like high cards or something, and I decided to mix in his hand as a bluff. The turn gives me extra outs, it gives me a good shot to the nuts. The river is pretty scary, it brings a 4 straight out there, so I decided to go for it because basically every hand that isn't a straight is put in a tough spot, and I think he might either overcall or overfold this spot. 2 hands after this I get dealt pocket queens in the big blind. First position limps, button raises to 4k, and now this guy 3 bets to 14k. He isn't that deep stack, so we're looking to just put all our money in with this hand, strong enough to get some value. If he ends up folding, we win 19k, which is very nice. But yeah, he calls and he has ace king, so yeah, he makes his flush unfortunately, but nothing you can do about it. Pocket 6 is strong enough to raise it up on the button. The big blind defends, and the board is pretty dry, and he leads for a small size. This board shouldn't really hit the big blind, but he thinks he can take it down with a small bet. And I actually make a play I wouldn't do that often and raise with my 6s, because he has a lot of overcards to my 6s that have a lot of equity. So I thought I was ahead and decided to min raise. The turn is one of those turns that is good for me. Now he bets half pot. And yeah, I still can fold. He can have a lot of flush draws and high cards. And the river is pretty interesting. It is a queen, and now he bets pot. So yeah, he wouldn't do that with just a queen. So he's basically saying he has a full house or a 3 of a kind, which is pretty hard to have. I knew I was good there. I was most afraid of the flush, and that one missed as well. I raise jack 8 suited under the gun, and I get 2 callers. The big blind 3 bets, which seems pretty strong, but he makes a mistake and makes it too small. So yeah, I come along, and this other guy comes along as well. Flop is pretty interesting. 2 hearts and jack, so that is a very good flop for us. The guy leads into 2 people, and I can either call or raise, but I prefer to just call, because that way I keep his bluffs in. Yeah, the turn is one of the worst cards in the deck, which is a king. Yeah, that sucks when you call, but you still have a river to make a flush or 2 pair. But he checks, which is a bit weird because the king should hit them pretty often. But yeah, no point in betting here, only getting called by a better hand most of the time. So I check back. And the river is a flush, so yeah, he leads out, which is strange, but maybe he's going for thin value with ace jack or pocket queens for this small size. But yeah, easy all in, and he says that he folded the queens with a heart. This hand I raise it up from the second position, and I get a call from the small blind and big blind. The board is pretty okay, we make a top pair. And now this guy leads, pretty small bet, and I'm thinking that raising is okay because we have the best hand most of the time. And this guy could just be betting with yeah, some kind of pair that doesn't want to see a 10 or a 6. So yeah, I raise and he calls. Turn doesn't really change anything, so going to bet again as I most likely have the best hand still. Thinking about checking back some rivers. Now this river is very interesting. It's the jack giving me a 2 pair, and I was thinking about checking back when I hit the jack, and I thought if he had a 10 he would bet the river himself, but then I was like he would still call with worst 2 pair and maybe even one pair type of hands, because some people like to call it off light as I'm checking back most of my hands. So yeah, I ended up going all in. So the button tries to isolate the limper, so I come along with my pocket eights, expecting that the big blind would defend most of the time or either fold. But he ends up 3-betting a little small size. So yeah, the button comes along, giving me a great price, so I would like to see a flop with this hand. Pretty reasonable flop for the pocket eights. Yeah, a lot of action in front of us. Taking a little bit of time to make it look like I have like pocket nines or maybe some other one pair type of hand. We make a full house on the turn, so we're pretty much good there. And yeah, we win the biggest pot of this series. Pocket kings on the button heads up. The big blind defends, and the flop is pretty good. When he leads like that for such a small price, it looks like one pair type of hand. So I decided to mix in a raise and get some value from those kind of hands. He calls, and I decided to go a bit larger on the turn as it brings in more draws. And I think that this guy likes to pay it off pretty light, so I decided to go pretty large on the river. But yeah, he ends up folding, but still we win a pretty nice pot. Ace jack heads up, I raise it up and the big blind defends again. This time we see a low flop, which is a good flop for the big blind and not so much for me. He leads into me again, and I decided to float with my 2 over cards. The turn is pretty good, it makes it less likely that he has a pair now. And he checks over to me, and I don't really see a reason to build a bigger pot, so I check in position. The river brings a flush, but gives me top pair as well. When I check, I usually have the best hand, so I go for some value. But he raises me pretty big, which I haven't really seen him doing that often, so it seems pretty strong to me. And I don't have a spade in my hand, which is bad. And when he goes for such a big size, I can let go a lot of hands and call with my stronger one. So I'd rather call with ace jack with the jack of spades. King 8 suited, raising it up. Small blind defense. And yeah, the board is pretty okay, hitting a second pair. So I decided to bet a little over half pot. On this queen there isn't really a point in betting, so I decided to check back. The river is pretty interesting as it pairs the board, making it less likely that he has a 10, and if he did have something could go for value, he would bet out, so this check is usually something that has enough value to win the hand, but not to bet out, so I decided to go for some thin value, which worked out pretty well. Queen 10 in the big blind. Getting great odds to defend, so I will. On this flop I make a top pair. I don't really see a point in betting, so I rather go for the check call. But it goes checked around. Turn brings another flush draw, so I'm going to bet and protect my hand. The button calls. And by checking I give him an opportunity to bluff me. So yeah, he bets, and this guy is pretty wild, so I can't fold. and we end up winning this pot. Ace king off in the small blind. First position limps and the button tries to isolate, but yeah, ace king is just too strong to flat, so I'm going to 3-bet this. Pretty small sizing, but that's to give the guy who limped a chance to come over the top, as I know he likes to. So yeah, pretty weird, the guy next to me calls, but he still comes over the top, and yeah, only one option, and that is to call. Yeah, pretty unfortunate we lost that hand, but yeah, he still has about 40% equity, so we're going to lose that hand 40% of the time. Ace 5 suited in the cutoff, raising it up, and the big blind defends. Pretty good flop. I make top pair, but I decided to check back because I can't go for 3 streets of value anyway. Turn is a deuce pairing the board, so basically every ace chops, and I decided to bet very small to put him in a tough spot. And he raises pretty small as well, so can't really fold to this size, and I decided to call. River is a queen, which is interesting because he bets pot now, and yeah, he's basically wrapping a deuce, but yeah, he only can have one combination of king deuce suited, and ace deuce offsuit is also possible out of the big blind, but there are just it's just a few combinations, and he can't really have ace king or ace queen because those hands would 3-bet pre-flop. So yeah, it's pretty strange the way he played this hand, but I can't fold obviously. First position opens and I decided to 3-bet this hand. Don't do this at home, guys. Yeah, the small blind comes along. This guy is now getting a great price, so he calls as well. Flop is pretty good for us. We pick up a flush draw, so we barrel for a half pot, and we get one caller. Turn is not a club, and I decided to double barrel this hand, trying to getting off a pocket pair that is above a 7, maybe some 7x, like 7-8 or 7-6. River doesn't change anything actually, and I was thinking about checking back because having 2 hearts in my hand isn't that great. But yeah, I don't really have that many bluffs in my range because other than hearts there weren't really any draws besides the backdoor flush draw that I would barrel with ace 5 clubs and those kind of hands. And I think I can still get him to fold a couple of hands like 7-6 of clubs, 8-7 of clubs and those kind of hands. So I decided to jam, and yeah, he ends up calling, and he has king queen, which is yeah, one of his best hands to call because he doesn't really have ace king that often, and he doesn't have a heart in his hand, which is good because that makes me more likely to have a heart. This guy joins the table and he posts his big blind and he checks. So it folds to me and I think I can just pick up those blinds. So I decided to mix in this hand, and yeah, he calls. This flop is pretty interesting because it shouldn't really hit him that often because he limped pre-flop. So he bets pretty small, and I decided to raise small as well because he doesn't have that many value hands and I would like to keep him in the pot. On the turn I decided to bet, which I think is okay, but I'd rather actually check call or check raise again. The river is pretty bad for me, it completes the flush, but yeah, some straights have missed, so I decided to check and evaluate. And when he bets such a weird size, I mean I don't really think he has a flush that often, because if he has a flush he would just go all in and get maximum value. So I ended up calling, and I was right, he missed his straight, very nice pot. Pocket 3 is on the button, trying to steal those blinds. But the big blind comes in for a 3-bet. His sizing is very small, so I'm getting great odds to call in position. Pretty reasonable flop for the pocket 3s again. Now he bets pot, and I was thinking about going all in, because if he has like queens and a king or an ace comes on the turn, that would kill some action. Versus this sizing, he will just jam the turn a lot, so not really a point in raising, because what hands would really raise versus this big sizing? Only sets, I think. So yeah, easy call. And yeah, he jams the turn himself, and we scooped this big pot. Very nice. After winning that big pot, this guy comes in for a big raise, and yeah, I have one of my strongest hands, so I decided to defend, hitting 2 pair on this board. But this guy now jams, which is strange. But yeah, this is one of my best hands that I can have. Ace queen I would 3-bet pre-flop, and besides queen 9 suited, I don't really have any of the sets, because those would 3-bet as well. I don't have to call that often, so I would call this hand. This hand I have ace 10 in the big blind, the button raises 2 times the blinds, and the small blind defense. With this hand I'm looking to pick up that money, which doesn't happen. Yeah, the flop is pretty reasonable, giving me a gut shot, so I'm planning on check calling, but he checks back. On this turn I could have the best hand, but I'm not sure, so I bet about half pot, and he comes along. The river is pretty interesting, because if I had 8-10 and bet the turn, I now have a straight, and yeah, he doesn't really have jack 10 or 8-10 that often, because jack 10 at the first place wouldn't check the flop, and I would definitely 3-bet jack 10 suited and 8-10 suited out of the big blind sometimes, so I'm going for an overbet. I also have a 10 in my hand, which blocks those combos, and it works out pretty well. This hand is pretty interesting. I decided to steal the blinds with the check 3 suited, small blind defense, and yeah, pretty dry board. So I decided to just take a stab at it. But he calls. The turn doesn't really change that much, and I decided to just give up, wave the white flag. The river doesn't change that much either. Now he bets 2/3 pot, and I was planning on folding, but then I was like, I do have a pretty reasonable hand to turn into a bluff. The story doesn't make that much sense, but some people will still fall for it. I mean, he can have clubs that missed, jack 10 missed as well, king 10 missed, just risking a little bit of money to win a big pot. So it doesn't even have to work that often, and I think this is a reasonable play. And yeah, he ends up folding, so very nice. Jack 5 suited on the button, looking to steal those blinds, but he defends his big blind. He leads out for a very small size, which is so weird, so I decided to mix in this hand as a bluff, and he comes along. This turn gives me a lot of outs, so I decided to barrel again. River is pretty interesting. It completes the flush, but it also pairs the board. Most of the time he has an ace, because I raised him on the flop, so he could let go of some sixes. And I would like to put an ace in a tough spot, so I decided to go pretty large on this board. And yeah, he ends up paying it off. And we are up 50 million from the last 2 episodes. Thanks for watching. If you did enjoy this video, make sure to leave a like, subscribe and comment if you want to.